and welcome to the Newconomy series. I am delighted to welcome our guest today, Alexandra Levin Kramer. Alexandra is a blockchain attorney at CKR Law, and she's also the co-founder at Women.io. Welcome, Alexandra. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So I'm going to have you introduce yourself to the audience in a minute, but first, I'm going to tell you about the upcoming segment. We're going to be talking about good environment in crypto from a legal standpoint. And so we're going to be leveraging a lot of your expertise here. Before we jump right in, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Crypterium. Crypterium is a mobile app that turns cryptocurrencies into money you can spend as easily as cash. With Crypterium, you can shop around the world, pay your bills, and pay with your coins and tokens at any terminal or simply by scanning QR codes. You can also send money across borders quickly for a fraction of the penny. All right, so back to you, Alexandra. Please, can you tell us a little about yourself, your industry experience, and just your background?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I am an attorney. I actually started my career as a securities attorney, representing clients mostly in Europe and in Asia, doing public and private capital raises. And so I started my career in London. After about 5 years in London, I came back to the States and ended up moving into the real estate industry. So I also have quite a bit of experience in real estate. When the market collapsed about just over 10 years ago, I went back to school and got a master's in real estate finance and actually launched an investment fund of my own with some partners in alternative real estate assets. So I've been basically both the attorney and the client, so to speak, both sides of the table. And I would say roughly in 2013, 2014, I started learning about blockchain technology. Interestingly enough, it was because someone had asked me if I had any plans on going back to school. And I thought, well, I have 3 degrees. Why would I want to go back to school? I think that's enough for one lifetime. And he said, oh, well, thanks to something I'm working on called blockchain technology, we're not going to need lawyers anymore. So you might want to think about a new profession. So I thought, that's quite dramatic, but let me take a look at this. And I actually grew up in Brooklyn, which is, as you may know, kind of the mecca of blockchain within the US. Started meeting very informally with some interesting folks, having coffee and drinks. And I took a couple coding classes as well, just to understand the basics of the technology. And realized that my very interesting and young friends who were very innovative had no clue as to how many securities laws and other kinds of laws they were allegedly, potentially violating. So I thought, there's an opportunity here. I kind of, initially as friendly advice, suggested that a lot of these innovators might want to seek legal advice. When they asked for referrals to attorneys who are so-called blockchain attorneys or blockchain lawyers, there weren't really many, if at all, at the time. And so what ended up happening is that along the same lines of this open source philosophy of the technology, even lawyers in this space started meeting informally and having open discussions about what are the consequences of issuing a cryptocurrency, what are the money transmission issues that may come up, securities, privacy, a whole host of issues beyond just the ICO world. So that's basically how I developed my practice, and I was asked to come over to my current firm, CKR Law, almost 2 years ago to actually launch a practice group specifically focused on blockchain technology and digital currency. This was still rather early days. There weren't many law firms doing this, if at all. So it's definitely been an adventure. I'm one of the few attorneys you will ever meet who was actually happy to get up in the morning and come to work every day. It's really been exciting because honestly, as a lawyer, once you graduate law school, it's very rare that you actually need to think very much about the law. In other words, as a transactional lawyer, which is what I am, it's really about the business terms of the deal and kind of documenting what that is. But here, within this industry, this is the first time that I've ever really had to think of what is a security. how do you apply laws that were established in 1933 and 34 to a completely innovative product that obviously wasn't contemplated at the time? So,
yeah.
And at my firm, I've been very lucky to have the support of the managing partner, Jeff Rind, and basically we are continuing to grow the practice group. We now have, just within my practice group, roughly 60 attorneys globally, not all of whom do this exclusively, but are also in practice groups like tax and estates, and obviously corporate and securities, commodities, money transmission, banking, lending, intellectual property, and so on and so on. And I think what's also useful is, as we saw in the ICO craze, that not many founders had any experience in the underlying industries. So, beyond blockchain, there along the same philosophy as every other application of blockchain, we remove intermediaries. You don't need to have a headhunter or recruiter charging enormous commissions. We are working with partners to provide digital identity verification. We're providing skills verification, which is, if you know the statistics, 40% of all workers in the US by next year will be freelancers. And so there's a huge market here, even just within the States. But and the fact that we're focused on women in particular is sort of my sweet spot, so to speak. I'm the oldest of 4 daughters. I went to Barnard College at Columbia University, the women's college, and I've always been a mentor to help bring more diversity, especially within this industry. You hear a lot about, the Bitcoin bros and the Lambos. And, there are already so many risks inherent in this space that if I was a young woman coming out of school thinking, well, what do I want to do with my life? I would probably run for the hills. I don't think we're not doing a great job of marketing this technology to bring in more diversity. So about a year ago, along with a great team, I organized something called Women on the Block. It was a full-day conference with 52 female speakers, and I'll end it there. But there's a lot of work that can be done. But certainly, I think each of us has a role to play, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Okay, I think what you're doing with Women.io is like so needed and really appreciated, because like you say, just the technology industry in general is really overwhelming, but then even trying to move into crypto or blockchain seems like a really huge task for women especially. So from me to you, keep doing what you're doing.
I'm trying. Well, you know what? The thing is that without making generalizations about women or versus men, I do think we are still at the early stages of the industry. Notwithstanding the collapse of the ICOs or the so-called crypto winter, I still think we're early enough that this is really where the future wealth is being made, right? And if we are excluding, whether intentionally or not, 50% of the population, that's another financial crisis, frankly, down the road. So to the extent that we can, educate, empower, network, provide skills, provide funding to diverse teams, whether they be as investors, founders, advisors, whatever the case is, then it's a no-brainer.
Thank you for the introduction, Alexandra. Before we dive into the full conversation, I'm going to explain how the interview is going to go. So we're going to have 2 segments. One is going to be live for our global online audience. And these are people who are tuning in from Facebook, from YouTube, from our website, and also from our community. And this is just going to be an introduction to the main topic of the day, which is good environment in crypto from a legal standpoint. So after this first segment, we're going to move into the second segment, which is going to be exclusively for our online community. So if you're watching from Facebook or YouTube right now, I want to ask you to click on the link below so that you're able to watch the entire conversation with Alexandra, because the second section is where we get into the meat of the entire interview. So we're good to go. So the first question I have for you today, I think you've already answered that, and it's how did you start your career in the legal blockchain space? So we're going to skip that and go to the next, which is, what are some of the most interesting blockchain companies you've heard of or worked with in your career?
What are some of the most interesting blockchain? What? I missed the word.
Companies.
Oh, yes. Okay, well, let me preface, as I am a lawyer, that whatever statements I make are my own. They don't represent my firm or my company. And, this is a risky business. You are all advised to seek your own legal, investment, accounting, tax advice, etc. Okay, so having gotten that out of the way, I would say, look, they're obviously the titans of blockchain at this point, whether, it's Ethereum and Consensus or some of the other larger, EOS blockchains. I mean, if we're talking about the blockchains themselves, I would say that certainly they're doing a lot of work, especially with a very global reach. I think that, we have to kind of, I would actually put into the same category, although it's not a company, I would say, certainly the United Nations, since I'm based in New York and I work quite a bit with industry leaders here in New York as well as outside of New York, the United Nations is actually doing quite a lot of work in terms of the applications of the technology to refugees and other humanitarian crises. The specific companies, again, I don't want to come across as promoting any specific company. I don't, that's not my thing. And I also don't want people to get the wrong impression because Alexandra Levin Kramer said she likes this company. Now everyone's going to go buy a token. I'm not a celebrity by any means, but if you read the SEC guidance, on celebrity endorsement, big no-no. But I do think, if I could actually talk about some of the companies that are doing interesting work for real use cases of the technology, I would say, certainly, as I mentioned, there are healthcare companies and real estate companies where if you dive, certainly in the case of healthcare, where it's about the ownership of the data, right? The same thing with even, my own platform. When you look at, no offense to Facebook, but if you look at LinkedIn and Facebook and some of the other large corporates, obviously, that, who's making money. It's not the users monetizing on their own data. It's the owners of the company and the shareholders. And so I think, certainly like in healthcare where it's such a personal private data that is being monetized by others, it's again a no-brainer that should be something that we each individually control in terms of who certainly gets access to the data, but monetizing that as well, who gets the financial benefit of it. Real estate is another really interesting use case, both for, I would even say humanitarian, but also, kind of commercial purposes, meaning, there have been, unfortunately, even within my lifetime, so many, wars and natural disasters where, unfortunately, because property information, deeds, titles, etc., are for the most part still being recorded the old-fashioned way, on with a pen and paper. When you have these kind of situations, then people lose all records of their land ownership, and that is, historically the main source of wealth. And so that's it, it's done. That happened in my own family's case during the Holocaust, during World War II. It's continuing to happen around the world. So I think, I've actually been working quite a lot with organizations such as, there's a nonprofit called FIBRI, which is the Foundation for International blockchain and real estate expertise. It's a European not-for-profit, and we're doing some pro bono work for them as well. And that's really to get to educate the real estate industry as to what blockchain is, what it's not. And I do want to emphasize, blockchain technology is not a panacea for all of the world's ills, right? I mean, it's not always the best solution. There are costs associated with it, but anyway, getting back to your original question, because I can go on a tangent. I do think those are probably the most interesting use cases. Employment, certainly. And the reason I don't want to mention specific companies is also because, to be honest, there haven't been many companies that have completely launched their products, right? That are actually operational. There were a lot of interesting startups raising capital through ICOs or traditionally, now through STOs, but until, we're just too early, honestly. We're too early to be able to comment one way or the other.
Giants. Yeah. Okay. So what opportunities are in blockchain that may not be in other fields? So this is regarding careers.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, so that's kind of, I would say, one of the best kept secrets, I guess, of the blockchain technology is again, admittedly, to a certain extent, some of what had happened in the last couple of years is a little bit of hype. But if we are to believe even a small percentage of the hype, I would say that the biggest gap is the need for developers and coders, people with real skills, and that cuts across all industries, meaning even for attorneys. When I routinely get emails and phone calls from either law students from my alma maters or from other referrals, and the question they always ask me is, well, what advice do you give to someone in law school? What should I be studying? What kind of classes should I be taking? And uniformly, I always say, take a class in coding. It's like, it's a new language. I mean, there are multiple languages, but getting back to the original reason why I got into blockchain, I don't think lawyers will disappear completely, but I do think certainly lawyers who so to speak, know this language, understand the basics of the technology, they will certainly continue to have a role and will advance over others who don't. I mean, it's really like any other language. If honestly, English was to a certain extent the global language, I think coding is going to be the next focus, and it's global. You can take it anywhere. I do think there are different levels of skill, certainly, and if anyone out there has an idea of or is thinking of what to do, I think coding academies are a great idea. I think I've been working with some groups that are trying to teach women to code in other parts of the world that don't have access to the kind of opportunities that we have in the States. And it's something, especially for women, if I can say that, it's funny because when I run events for the benefit of the public, really, they're free usually, and I've always had kind of a diverse panel, both gender and background, geographic, age. It's interesting because the women, when I've asked them to speak, once in a while I'll get a response like, well, I don't have a master's or PhD in blockchain technology, so I'm not really an expert. And okay, usually the guys, I've never heard that from a dude, right? So I think we kind of need to have opportunities to gain those skills, to feel more comfortable that we know what we're talking about when we voice an opinion. But definitely, there are a lot of opportunities for developers. There are a lot of opportunities for people coming from even the traditional world. I mean, certainly as we move towards STOs, and recognizing that the token offerings, for the most part, were offerings of securities. I think anyone that comes from that background, from Wall Street, from having, a broker-dealer license, for example, it has an advantage. But again, we need to understand each other. And that's kind of one of the reasons why, even at my own firm, CKR Law, we are looking a lot at how lawyers are going to be serving clients in a different way using this technology. And I find that, I'm currently actually in the process of trying to figure out like the common language, right? Lawyers don't speak code, and coders don't speak law. So we're figuring that out, but it's a really interesting process. So I think anyone who even is considering traditional careers like law or finance or accounting, my advice is definitely to also look into how blockchain technology affects those industries.
Yeah, that's great advice. You've mentioned twice in your answers STOs. Can you just briefly explain what that is?
Sure. So it's not a legal term. It's sort of an industry slang, but basically, where in 2016, 2017, and to a certain extent 2018, there were the ICOs, right, the initial coin offerings. Probably not the best term to have used then either, but I think for the most part, with obviously not having done the analysis on each of the thousands of ICOs, I think the general consensus is that many of those offerings, as I said, were actually offerings of securities. Not necessarily all of them. I follow the SEC guidance on this, but I think we're now in a position, especially with having the industry mature to a certain extent, having institutional investors starting to get involved. And so I'm referring, of course, to university endowments like Yale, investing in crypto funds, MIT, Harvard, some of the others, and also the larger institutions like pension plans and others who are kind of still to a certain extent on the sidelines, but looking at the space closely. And so I think the recognition that most of the tokens sold, again, without going into the full legal analysis, if you want to kind of, again, I would suggest that everyone seek their own legal advice. But if you are basically selling a token in order to raise capital to build a platform that doesn't exist yet, then you're likely to be considered security. And so what's happening now in the market is that basically those players who are still around, meaning because of the so-called crypto winter, a lot of players who were, to put it politely, not as legitimate as some who have remained, we're now kind of left with people who are very serious about the technology and are not necessarily just trying to make like a quick buck. Although there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to do it in a legal, legitimate way. So I think those of us who are left are recognizing that the tokens, if they are, as I mentioned, following a certain model, are likely to be considered securities. And so then, okay, let's deal with it. Let's be compliant with laws. Let's create new laws. Let's get licensed where necessary. I mean, I think, and then those institutional players that I mentioned earlier are much more comfortable to get involved, even in a limited way. Now, I think to a certain extent, if I can admit this, I'm probably a bit of an anarchist at heart. So I do understand, and that's why I fell in love with blockchain technologies, because I do think it's especially when Satoshi's paper came out after the crisis, that there's a real problem in the current banking system and the current, even to a certain extent, the current legal system. And so I totally get it. I totally get this need to have, financial inclusion without intermediaries and all the other fantastic use cases. But the fact is that we live in the real world where there are laws existing to protect the so-called unsophisticated. So until we change those laws, which are starting to happen. I mean, I can speak to the U.S., or you probably have another question later on focusing on this, but it's starting to happen. And there are really some interesting jurisdictions around the world that are trying to address this issue while still, again, protecting the innocent, so to speak.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that. This leads us to the penultimate question before we get into the good environment questions. And this one asks, what are some pros and cons of working in block space or crypto? And do you think it's a stable industry to bet your entire career on?
Oh my, okay, so let me answer the first question. I would say certainly if you are entrepreneurial, if you are creative, if you can think outside the box, then there's room for you in this industry. I think it's like I said earlier, for me, having come from a very traditional background, working at two of the largest law firms in the world in London and New York, I'm probably not your typical blockchain enthusiast, but I did grow up in Brooklyn, so I have that. But I do think that there are many advantages to being in this industry. As I said, it's an adventure for me every day. Working with clients who are innovative and trying to create real solutions to real problems. However, there are certainly risks associated. I think there are a lot of legal issues that still need to be worked out. I think that there are some still, as I mentioned earlier, less than legitimate players in the industry who are, looking to make a quick buck and not be compliant with law. So, you need to be very careful who you associate with. You need to be careful where your name is used, or your picture, your photo is used. That's unfortunately happened quite a bit. So, and I think, I think people who are smart you need to also know the questions to ask, which I think people don't always know. In other words, I have some very sophisticated clients, and I have other clients that are so enthralled by their startup or their platform that they forget that we still live in the real world. And unfortunately, in the early days when I would suggest to some innovators that they might want to seek legal advice, there was certainly a minority of people who came back to me and said, legal advice, we're beyond the law. or saying things like the regulators can just suck it, like that philosophy doesn't go very far. Or there's this idea of, well, good luck to them, let them try to catch me because we're beyond jurisdiction. No, that's not how it works, because ultimately they will find you wherever you are, and they will. I mean, because I think that the concepts that we're talking about in blockchain, like a DAO, or these sort of virtual entities, it's a real conundrum. But ultimately, the US regulators and other regulators have dealt with innovation before. This is not the first go around, and so I think I would just be very careful and cognizant of the real risks involved, whether it's, the legal risk, the financial risks. You could, we know the volatility of many of if we're just talking about the coins, the cryptocurrencies is huge. I mean, it's been relatively stable, I guess, over the last month or so, but people have lost a lot of money in this space. And so to answer the second part of your question, I mean, I think it's always a risk to put all your eggs in one basket, right? Okay. But I think even within blockchain, I mean, like look at me, right? So I'm not just a lawyer in the space. I'm also a founder of a startup. I'm also involved in non-for-profits. I'm also, running educational programming. So I think I wear a lot of hats. And that wasn't intentional. That was just because I saw a need to do something, and I stepped up. So I think whether it's helped me in the long run, probably. A lot of what I do, I don't get paid for, to be honest. So I think, people looking to enter this space should get their feet wet, is not to expect. It's like anything, when you're in college, people would say, well, get an internship in a field that you're interested in, even if it's not paid. So that's definitely my advice, is if you're thinking about entering this industry, go to some of the non-for-profit events, associations, where at least you can hopefully trust that you're not being taken advantage of. And speak to people who've been around for more in this industry for more than a year or two. People who've been doing this for, it's funny to say in this industry, because it's only been around, if you want to think about it, since Bitcoin, although technically cryptography and the technology has been developing for many more years before that. But if someone says they're an expert and they only started getting involved in this space in the last year or two, I would be very wary. So be careful who you talk to. Assume everything you say is being recorded and can be used against you, and learn. You learn every day. So enjoy.
Yeah, thank you. These are really great advice. Taking notes in my head. Do you have any personal experience dealing in cryptocurrencies? Any wins or massive failures?
Oh my goodness. Can I disclose that? So yes, I do own some cryptocurrency. I was lucky in the sense that I got in pretty early. So for me, I have quite a different perspective. I'm not a day trader, so I know there are people out there looking, not just daily, but like hourly, by the minute at their portfolio, like, oh, did it go up, did it go down? I don't have, the blood pressure for that. Like, I wouldn't be able to live my life that way. So I'm in it for the long term. I think I'm definitely following a lot of the new developments coming out. Of course, JP Morgan is coming out with its own coin, and they've been actually involved in cryptocurrency for a long time. For most of that time, led by actually a fantastic woman in the space named Amber Valdez. So I think there are a lot of interesting developments. And of course, cryptocurrency is not the same as blockchain technology. I think people kind of, especially in the media, become a little bit obsessed with, Bitcoin or Ether or Litecoin or whatever, and forget that there's actually, to me at least, what's more interesting is the application of the technology to other things. But certainly, I think, but I also got involved in cryptocurrency because I actually used it as a currency, right? Not as an investment initially. And in my, I have used cryptocurrency to purchase things, to pay for services. And it's been fantastic. That was sort of the original purpose of it all. But yeah, a lot of people are just sitting on it, waiting for it to go up, but I see it as opportunity. When the price goes down, to me, it's an opportunity to buy more. Again, you have to be careful of what you buy and making sure you record it, because it's in the US and many other countries, it's all, taxable. So people forget that even if you exchange it for another coin, it still may be taxable. But yeah, I that's a good question, because I find, when I meet other so-called experts in this space, I personally don't ask that question because I think it's very private, to be honest, and it's not my business. I don't ask them, do you have shares in Coca-Cola? So I'm not going to ask them if they do this, but I do find that the response when people are asked that question is very telling. Because again, if someone says they're a blockchain expert, but they don't have a digital wallet, they don't own any coins, okay. It's a little questionable.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much. This has been a really interesting first segment. I'm definitely looking forward to the second one. Before we move on, I'm speaking to the audience now. If you're watching on YouTube or Facebook, this is the time to click the link below and join the exclusive community to hear the rest of this interview. We're going to be talking about good environment in crypto from a legal standpoint. So now we're going to switch over to our technical team, and then they're going to switch us over to the community segment. Great. This will take about 2 minutes to 2 minutes. So talk to you soon.
Okay, thank you.